Hello everybody, welcome back. We're on to Module 5 now. We're talking about less lethal weapons this week. This week you had a few more articles. We had most of them were on tasers and generally the effect of using less than lethal weapons in policing. So those are pretty important things to think about as we're looking at the use of force, how technology has changed how we see the use of force in the criminal justice system. And so the use of force is a particularly important topic for technology, especially when it comes to police, because police officers do actually have the legal authority to use force when carrying out their duties. They're one of the few professions that actually have this, when it's justified, of course. And so, just to give you a little bit of background on the use of force and its use in criminal justice, for those of you that might not be aware, maybe you haven't taken a policing class, but police use of force is actually very rare. And most estimates say that the police actually use force in only about 1% of their police citizen encounters. And then deadly force is actually used extremely rarely, and it's only a fraction of a percent the time that police use deadly force. Because you imagine if they're only using force, period, 1% of the time, a very small amount of that use of force is actually going to be deadly force. Most of it is going to be what we're going to talk about, which is the use of less than lethal force. So regardless of what you might see in the media, this is occurring and it is getting a lot of attention, mainly because of the use of force in unjustifiable situations, which is what's getting most of the media attention right now, is when police are using deadly force or other types of force when there shouldn't be. And so we'll talk about this stuff as we move along. But so an interesting question to think about is, why use less lethal technology? Why do we need this? Why don't we just not use it? Well, this creates another tool within the police officer's tool belt to be able to carry out their duties. And I say tool belt metaphorically, but then if you think about literally too, it also applies to that, and the duty belt that they would wear with all of their various tools of the trade, if you will. But looking at why I use this, well, we can control suspects who physically resist easier, and without having to resort to lethal force when we might have had to before. We can protect officers from harm, which is a big goal. We can also protect the criminal suspect. If there's an instance where there is a suspect who's armed with a knife, a police officer can use something like a taser to subdue this suspect rather than having to use his sidearm. And so that actually tends to help the suspect to not be shot, to be tased instead. And as we'll look at, some of these other less lethal technologies would not be as useful in instances where you had someone with a knife or something like that, and officers might not be willing to, for example, pepper spray someone if they were coming at them with a knife, because that would not have that instantaneous stop of their advancement and their attack. Whereas a taser, once the person is tased, they're immediately immobilized. And so this is an interesting thing to think about. So there's several types of less than lethal devices. Like I said, we're going to talk mainly about tasers. They're the most innovative and the most new, and probably, I would say, involve the most advanced technology, if you will. But there are some others. So conducted energy devices, CEDs, is what we're talking about when we talk about the taser. But if you think about it, there are also other types of less than lethal devices. A big one has been pepper spray, or OC spray, if you will. OC stands for Oleium capsium, which is actually the active ingredient in there, which is based upon a red pepper, very hot red pepper, which actually causes the burning and irritation when you're sprayed with it. There's actually distraction devices, bright lights and noises. Those of you that have ever been in the military might be familiar with things like flashbangs and things like that. These would be things that would be more so used by SWAT teams or other tactical units. It's not really something that your average police officer down the street or driving down the street would be equipped with. But it is another less than lethal type of device that can be used to immobilize people or distract them, things like that. There's also vehicle stopping technology like deflators and those barrier, the spike strips and things like that, as well as blunt force objects. You have your projectiles like your rubber bullets. You have bean bags. There's beanbag guns, and then there's the old-fashioned police baton. This has evolved over time, and it used to be just a slapstick or a little small billy club. Then it evolved into what we call the PR-24, which was that the kind of L-shaped baton that had the little side handle on it. And nowadays, you rarely see officers carrying any of those things unless they're going into more of a riot situation. And now they just have the small. I'm trying to think if I have that. I don't have one in my office. But a small collapsible baton. Maybe I'll bring one for the next lecture and show you all what the collapsible batons look like. I used to have a PR-24, but I don't have one of those anymore. Someone else used that and it got misplaced while that person was engaged in what they were doing with it. So anyway, moving along, looking at questions surrounding less lethal weapons. When should less lethal weapons be used? Where do these weapons fall along the use of force continuum? We're not going to get into the use of force continuum a whole lot for our purposes. Pardon me. Sorry, we got a little feedback here on the radio. And so looking at, are these lethal weapons effective? Do these weapons accomplish their goals? If they don't, maybe we need to reevaluate them. That's something that we talked about in the very first introductory module. How much harm do less lethal weapons cause? Do these weapons house unnecessary injury or deaths to criminal justice or to criminal suspects or to officers themselves? It's all things to think about as we're moving forward. So just to start, I wanted to talk about pepper spray and pepper spray and is pepper spray effective? So looking at the data from a 2003 NIJ report, they covered two unpublished studies on pepper spray use. One was where they looked at the first study as officers and suspect injuries in North Carolina, and then the second one was examined the deaths of 63 suspects held in custody after pepper spray was used. And that's an interesting thing, that most of the deaths regarding pepper spray actually happen afterwards, and oftentimes some time after it's occurred, as with tasers too. So looking at the first thing that I wanted to show you all, which was this little, let me see if I can get a laser pointer to work here. So looking at this graph that we have here, this is what we would call in research methods or in criminology an interrupted time series analysis. And so we have these time periods over January 91, it's about every 6 months. And we have these data collections. And so here's the number of injuries starting at about, let's say that was about 8 in January of 91, and then it goes up a little bit. And you can see how this changes a little bit every 6 months. Well, here is January of 1995, which is where Charlotte actually introduced pepper spray to their police officers. They started issuing pepper spray. Before that, they didn't have pepper spray, believe it or not. And so what we see here is the officer injuries go down pretty much fairly consistently, except for this one area here, after the pepper spray was introduced. Here we had much higher levels, almost 20 in July of 1991, and here we go, we're down here much lower, looking at almost 0 in some of these areas. Just a little side note, one of the interesting things to look at here is the way this goes up and down, and the way they selected to change this from January to July. For those of you that don't know, there's much more crime often and much more going on in July because it's summertime than there is in the winter months. So that's another thing to think about there from a chronological perspective. And so then looking at Winston-Salem, which is another city in North Carolina, we see it's introduced here, and we do see this downward trajectory that goes along this way, but it's not quite as much as it was before. But so these things would tend to suggest, and then looking at suspect entries, we see that those go down as well after the pepper spray was introduced in Charlotte. So we're seeing a decline in injuries, both for police officers and suspects. And looking here, we see back in Winston-Salem with the suspect injuries, we see that these things went down and were significantly less than they were before here. Just as kind of a rudimentary way of examining these things, just to illustrate the point. But looking at study number 1, so their conclusions were that the North Carolina study found that the number of injuries to police officers and suspects declined after pepper spray was introduced, as I said. Complaints that the police use excessive force also declined too. They don't tend to get as many excessive force complaints out of pepper spray as they would from other methods of perhaps using a baton and things like that, as you guys have probably seen in the news and things like that, especially if you were looking back in the 80s in that period before pepper spray was introduced. You had the Rodney King beatings and things like that, where police were habitually using their nightsticks or billy clubs or whatever you want to call them, and using them in an unjustified way. Pepper spray is not a combative weapon. It's just something you spray at someone, and it's more difficult to abuse. Obviously, if you're spraying someone that's completely compliant, then you would be abusing it, but that doesn't happen as much. What tends to happen is that the police officers will sometimes get mad, and when they're hitting someone with their baton, might hit them more than they should have gotten hit. But pepper spray, that doesn't tend to happen. You get a level of saturation with pepper spray where it's just all over your face, and that doesn't really happen with getting beat in the face with a billy club, because you can get beat more and more and your injuries get worse, whereas it doesn't really happen as much with pepper spray. Anyway, so in the second study, they actually found that pepper spray contributed to the death of 2 of the 63 cases. So it actually contributed to that. Now, these were 2 people that had asthma. And so they had asthma, they had labored breathing after they had been pepper sprayed, and so that led to their death down the road. Yes. So another thing to think about is the background on the taser. So the taser was originally developed in the 1970s. Over 11,000 law enforcement agencies authorized taser use. There's about 225,000 officers equipped with a taser. 120,000 civilians use a taser. And then, you have your volunteer uses and your other real-life uses during confrontations. So these things are getting used quite frequently. The taser as a less lethal force alternative. Now we're getting into a little bit of the White and Reddy article, which is this Police Quarterly article that you all were reading this week. And so this article examines, from a large metropolitan police department, 243 taser incidents in a 3-year period. So the main variables of interest there were the suspect's demographics, the emotional and physical state of the suspect's behavior, whether there were any weapons present, the officer's assignment, and the characteristics of the taser use. How far away was the person? What effect did it have on the person? Things like this. These are all things that they made sure to control for, because they could, if you're looking at use of a taser more often and you don't control for whether the suspect's behavior or whether the suspect has a weapon, then that could lead you to some misleading findings there. So based upon this study, we're looking at who was tased. Well, 86.8% of the people that were tased were male. For those of us that are studying criminology or have studied or taken some classes or whatever your level of knowledge is, the fact that most of the people were male is probably not a big surprise. Women get dealt with far less frequently in the criminal justice system and by police than males do, and women tend to be a little bit less aggressive oftenly. Then 51% of the people that were tased were African American. Looking at use of force and different minorities varies across place. The average age was 35 years old. Even though there were three incidents that involved a juvenile, and 6 of them involved people that were over 60 years old. It's not really the best policy to use a taser on someone who is that old, because they are more likely to have pacemakers and have heart problems and things like that. But, a police officer has someone with a gun or a knife coming at them and they refuse to stop. They have to do something to neutralize this person. They can't just say, I'm sorry that, you're older than 60. I don't know if you are or not, so I can't use my weapon to defend myself. That's just not a reasonable policy. So the taser is a less lethal force alternative. So looking at the suspect's emotional and physical state, 14% of the suspects appeared to be intoxicated. Either they were using alcohol or drugs or both. When you think about, if someone is going to go and attack an armed police officer, then maybe there is some sort of level of intoxication and maybe their emotional state is not quite what it should be. Were the suspects armed? 40% were armed with a weapon. Of those, about 67% of the armed suspects had a knife or some sort of cutting instrument. Police officers would be more likely to use a taser in this instance. If someone was armed with a gun, they're probably not going to use a taser in that instance. They're probably going to use their sidearm. And that would be what their training would dictate, that if someone's coming at you with a gun or attempting to shoot you with a gun, you don't try to shoot them with a taser. Because their gun has a pretty good range on it, as does yours, but the taser has a limited range because of where those barbs shoot out. They are wired, so they can only go a certain distance. And so if you were to try to use a taser in that instance, you run the risk of the taser not working, and then you could possibly be shot instead. Were the deployments effective? 90% of the cases, both contacts hit the suspect. So like I said, you've got these 2 barbs that shoot out of a taser, and what happened is they stick. You're taught to shoot at center mass, and they stick in the person. And then they have wires attached to them. That's where the electricity comes from. Now, both of these barbs have to hit the person in order for it to conduct the electricity through their body. And so in 90% of cases, this actually happened. In 10% of the cases, this didn't work. Maybe one barb hit the person and the other one didn't, or neither one of them did. Who knows? 85% of the suspects were subdued by the taser and taken into custody. So even when the taser is used, there's 15% of the time this still didn't subdue them. And so 80% of the officers believed that the taser performed satisfactorily. They were satisfied with its performance, and they were happy with what occurred. And probably the main goal there would have been to subdue the suspect and so that they can be taken into custody. The general findings, too, also show that this taser seems to be very effective in high-risk situations, such as a situation where you have someone coming at you with a knife. There's something in policing known as the 21-foot rule, where any person that has a knife that is within 21 feet of a police officer can run towards the police officer and stab that police officer in the time that it takes the officer to pull out his sidearm and shoot that person. So anytime you have someone coming towards you to assault you with a knife that's within 21 feet, you're in risk. It's a high risk situation. Obviously, police officers pull out the taser just about as fast as they can their sidearm and shoot the person with the taser too, which is what provides that alternative ability to use that less than lethal force, rather than, an officer, like I said, would not try to shoot someone with pepper spray who's charging them with a knife. It's just not a good maneuver to make. So looking at this next article, the McDonald and colleagues article, the effect of less lethal weapons on injuries in police use of force events. So this article looked at 12 police departments who provided data for more than 24,000 police use of force incidents. And so looking at the different things that they examined, 39% of the suspects were injured in these incidents, compared to 13% of police officers who were injured. And then looking at the use of force, 50% was just physical force. And then 23 was OC or pepper spray. And then you had another 22%, which was the CED or taser use. They also looked at some demographic characteristics too, which we're not going to get into. So what did they find? They found that the likelihood of injury to suspects and officers was significantly lower when police officers used less lethal weapons instead of physical force. If a police officer gets into a fight with a suspect, well, that police officer might be able to eventually subdue him, but they're going to tussle for a little while. They're going to go back and forth. The suspect might be able to get some hits in. The officer might not even be successful in subduing the person, depending upon the officer and his training, the number of officers, how big the person is, things like that. But when you give officers these other tools like this, where they can get kind of a leg up on the suspect, it allows less injuries for the police officer and less injuries to the suspect themselves. So, tasing is not pleasant, but it's certainly better than having a bunch of nightclub sticks beat you and have to go to the hospital. Once the taser is done, it's over with. And then we also found that injury to police officers dropped significantly after adopting the taser devices. And so generally their findings suggest that the incidence of injuries can be reduced substantially when police officers use CEDs and OC spray in lieu of physical force. And so this is what's been happening a lot, is officers are not really using physical force. They're not getting down on the ground and wrestling people as much as they used to, because now technology is allowing police officers to use other avenues of subduing people. So the impact of tasers on police use of force decisions. How often do police officers use a taser as a response to different levels of suspect resistance? To what extent do police officers use the taser as an alternative to other force options? And what are the circumstances under which the taser is associated with a reduction in the use of other less lethal options? So this is getting into the questions by the Sosa, Reddy, and Michael Alt article, which was in the Journal of Experimental Criminology, which is a pretty good journal. So looking at this, here is an example of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department and their use of force decisions. This is very similar to many other police departments and the continuum of force policy. So at level 1, the very lowest level that you'll have there, you have compliant behaviors, suspects being compliant, and even level 2 you have compliant behaviors, which is not often the same at different levels for other police departments. But then again, you might look at this as being different if you have level 1 compliant behaviors where you just ask them to do something, and then maybe level 2 you asked them and they didn't do it, but then you told them or you threatened them and then they became compliant. And so that becomes another level perhaps for Las Vegas police. And then at level 3 you might have passive resistance. This is just people going limp or refusing to comply with what you do. They're not attacking you or anyone else, but they're still not doing what you want them to do. Maybe they're ignoring you. Who knows? And then you have physical requiring of arrest or control and self-defense. So if the person is actively resisting arrest, or they're active, this would be level 4, if they're actively resisting arrest, or if they're actively attacking you, then that would be level 5, and then that would be justified use of a taser. And then level 6 would be if someone is trying to kill you or someone else, and that would be the only time that a firearm would be immediately necessary, would be some situation where someone has a gun and they're shooting at you. Obviously, you're not going to pepper spray that person. You're going to go right to level 6 right there, because the person has actually brought it to that level. Yeah. So, the impact of the tasers on the use of force decisions. So, looking at the officers, we had about 31.8%, or 31.8 is the average age of the officers. There's only about 6% were female, 22% non-white, 6% or 6 average years of police experience. Their average body weight was 199 pounds, 70 inches tall, 41% had military experience. And so, you know, this body weight and height and stuff like that, and even gender can play a role. You know, I'm 6 foot and 250. You know, if some, you know, smaller guy comes and wants to resist me, I'm going to be more effective at being able to use physical force to subdue them and get them under control, provided they don't have a knife or any other sort of weapon, than someone who was much smaller. Maybe you had a 120-pound person trying to subdue a 250-pound man who has decided he didn't want to be arrested. And so these can lead to different usages of the taser, or OC spray or something like that. I know personally, I'm not a big fan of OC spray because it is not fun to get in your face. I've had it in my face, not from the police, but by shooting other people with it. You know, and I tell you, it gets messy. It can get on you when you're the person shooting it, and it does not come off easily. For those of you, you know, when we take people downtown, the police department, you know, after they've been pepper sprayed, people that go downtown, they get to rinse their eyes out with water, which I think actually makes it much worse. And, you know, when I've ever gotten it in my eyes, I use milk, because milk will actually neutralize that. I don't know if any of you have ever had hot sauce, something that was too hot that you've eaten and you've gotten in your mouth. Maybe you had some really, really hot wings or something like that. Drinking water doesn't tend to help that much, but drinking a glass of milk actually neutralizes it, and is one of the few things that make it better. Unfortunately, at the jail, they don't have milk for everybody, so those people that get OC sprayed do not get to have milk. Then again, if you're an officer and you happen to get it in your eyes, you can go to whatever your local gas station is down the street and get you some milk after you've taken care of whoever you have sprayed. Anyway. So, looking at the other findings, being armed with the taser did not affect how police officers responded to non-aggressive suspects. So they're being non-aggressive, that doesn't mean they're being tased. We have seen some stuff in the media recently where officers have said, okay, if you don't want to listen to me, I'm going to tase you. That would be a misuse of the taser. It shouldn't be tasing people that are at those lower levels of the continuum of use of force, as we showed. People that are just being passive or being compliant should not be getting tased. This would be a misuse of the tool, the same way it would be with a firearm or anything else like that. So officers armed with tasers were less likely to use batons or discharge firearms. That's another thing. Police officers, like I said before, if they have someone with a knife, they might be able to use a taser to discharge that, to tase them, to subdue them, rather than having to shoot them. However, a police officer, if he did not have a taser and someone came at him with a knife, his training would dictate that he would shoot that person and use his sidearm. Not too many officers would, and they certainly wouldn't be trained to go at someone with a knife with their baton. But you know, police officers often are using less of their batons too, because the taser's simply easier to use. And that's what this next implication says, officers favored the tasers over other less than lethal and even lethal methods of use of force. Police officers don't want to shoot people with their sidearm if they don't have to. Other than killing the person, it's also a lot of paperwork, a lot of investigation, a lot of other things going on there. These things still occur with tasers, but it's not quite as big of a deal. Most likely because the suspect is still alive. So, looking at summing all of this up, less than lethal weapons. We looked at 3 different articles. White and Reddy studied 243 taser deployments. 85% of the suspects were successfully incapacitated. I would say that that's a success. You got those 15%, but 85 is still pretty good, I would say. And that's just one study. The McDonald study reduced injuries to officers and civilians by 25%. I would say that that's successful too. Reducing injuries to not only officers but suspects and civilians is a big success. And then looking at the last article, the field experiment, finding that officers with tasers were less likely to use batons and destroy firearms. All of these things tend to suggest that the tasers are successful in helping police officers to perform their duties. And they are successful at being another piece of technology that helps criminal justice to be efficient and successful at doing its job while using the minimum amount of force necessary. And sometimes, when you're using a taser instead of using your sidearm to get someone with a knife, where you would be perfectly justified in using your sidearm, you're saving that person from being shot and most likely dying if they've been shot. Whereas, as we're going to see, there are some people that do die, from the taser, but it's far less, and the fatality rate is far less than being shot in center mass. Because police officers are not trained to shoot people in the leg and things like that. It's very difficult and very challenging, whereas, they are trained to shoot for the biggest part of your body, which also happens to be one of the areas of your body that can not sustain too much damage. So, there are a number of reported sudden deaths following taser administration. And Amnesty International reports nearly 500 deaths in the U.S. after taser use. So, the tasers were rolled out quite some time ago, and 500 deaths, it's certainly less than there have been for police shootings since the tasers have come out. So, some reports suggest that most cardiac events are not triggered until 5 to 40 minutes after the taser is used. And actually, this stuff has gotten a lot better. When the tasers first came out, they were having some trouble with, it was actually the active ingredients in the OC spray were flammable, and so they had some people that actually caught on fire because they had been sprayed with the pepper spray and then tased, and so then the flammable agent in the pepper spray actually caught on fire when the taser was then administered and created a spark. And so obviously this is not occurring anymore. They've resolved that issue, and so this stuff is always changing and always evolving to get better. That's why it's important that we study these things to see what are the best ways of working with these things and how they can be best used to be effective and to be safe. Cardiac arrest, you would think is going to occur while the electricity is going through your body, but like the research says, is actually occurring sometime after that, which gets into biology and the medical sciences a little bit more than I'm prepared to talk to you all about. I do not have a medical doctor. I have a PhD, so I'm, I guess, what you would call or I would jokingly call a fake doctor. I cannot write you any prescriptions or tell you about cardiac arrest and how to prevent it and things like that. So, interestingly, people that are under the influence of drugs, like cocaine, meth, PCP, things like that, and then they are tased, they actually become more likely to die. And this is interesting because all of these drugs are stimulants. So for those of you that don't know, cocaine, meth, PCP, all of these things are bad for your heart anyway. all of these things, when you take them, they increase your risk of cardiac arrest. And so now you're at increased risk of cardiac arrest because you are under the influence of cocaine or PCP or something like that. But then you're also introducing the effects of the electronic shock, and so that just exponentiates your likelihood of going into cardiac arrest, because you have now two different factors which can cause you to go into cardiac arrest, but you're having two of them instead of just one of them. Interestingly, people that are on PCP and meth and things like that also have an increased risk of being tased or things like that, because they often tend to be more aggressive and their demeanor is a little bit different because of their drug use, and so they are more aggressive and are more likely to have force used against them by the police. So, are tasers safe? It is vitally important to assess whether tasers use on humans increases the risk of psychological stress. Looking at all of this impairments, cardiac muscle damage, sudden health, all this other stuff, this is all important stuff to think about. Each subject is exposed to a 5-second taser discharge. And this is another article that I'm just telling you about from the medical sciences. But it's not something that I expect you guys to know a lot about. I just wanted to expose you all to it. And so they said that there's no change in electrolytes in the 60 minutes after the taser administration. And they had people that had exercised and people that hadn't exercised. But they did say that there is a modest increase in the respiratory rate of persons after they've been exposed to a taser. It is electricity going through your body, so it would be expected to change your breathing a little bit. But it returned to normal after about 10 minutes. So, you got tased. Most likely what's happening is your body is releasing adrenaline and things because it's not sure what's happening. But about 10 minutes later, it goes down and things are about normal. So no changes in breathing or other physiological stress after the tasers. So this article also talks about, there are always study limitations, and that's okay. But looking at, the limitations of this study, the subjects were generally healthy and disease-free, but the study did not exceed single 5-second bursts. That's generally what will happen with the tasers. You get a 5-second burst per trigger pull, and police officers should not be pulling the trigger more times than it takes to subdue the suspect. Subjects are not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, so this study didn't figure out, what happens if we tase people when they're on PCP compared to cocaine or drugs at all. They didn't want to put them at that high risk because, when we do research, we don't want to, run the risk of killing anyone. And so they didn't want to make that high level of risk. They found that the research was not, the benefits of doing that would not outweigh the risk. And then the suspects were not in an agitated state. Generally in the field, when you come across someone that's going to be tased, chances are they're going to be agitated, they're going to be violent, they're going to have a lot of adrenaline going through their body, things like this. So one important thing to think about is this is not an industry-funded study. This is not a study that was made by the people that are owners of the taser company, the people that are producing them. That would create a lot of bias in that study, right? Because they have an interest in keeping tasers on the market. This was done by independent researchers, so I'd say it gives it a little bit more reliability, and they don't really have that issue with having a bias or, trying to think of the word I'm looking for. We'll go with bias. Conflict of interest. There we go. That's what I was trying to think of. They're not going to have that conflict of interest because they have no benefit of whether the tasers are safe or unsafe. They're just objectively looking at it. Whereas the taser industry might have some vested interest in making sure that tasers stay on the market. So, what are the policy implications from all of this? Remember, these are less than lethal weapons, not non-lethal weapons. We've shown some cases where it is possible people can die from them. there really aren't any non-lethal weapons. People can die even, with a fist fight from being punched in the head in the right place. So even your fists are not really a non-lethal weapon. People can die from pepper spray, batons, things like that. So they're less lethal, but they're not non-lethal. The evidence suggests that these less lethal weapons can keep suspects and officers safer. And this, of course, is a good thing. So agencies need to consider increased use of less lethal weapons, if appropriate, depending upon their situation. That might be what they want to think about doing. Maybe departments get tasers and things like that. So the ethical implications. This research doesn't answer any ethical concerns. For example, should the criminal justice actors be spending or sending high amounts of electricity through a person's body? Is that ethical? Is that not? That's something for you all to think about in your ethics course. Is it ethical to use a tool that is less lethal than a sidearm to stop someone with a knife instead of using the sidearm? I would say absolutely. Is it ethical to use the taser in a situation where you could use some sort of physical force? I don't know. It would depend on the situation. So these are all things to think about, just some kind of food for thought. So use of these weapons are relatively safe, but work to improve these weapons has to continue. Like I said, back when they first came out, there was a lot more problems that have now been resolved. And so, 20 years from now, we'll probably have something else that's completely different. It just shoots out a bubble that wraps you up and you can't move and you're like this, kind of like the car foam that they're coming out with, which, just keeps you all secured in there so you don't bounce around when you get in a car accident, which is not very widespread either. But anyway, so we can reasonably be assured that less lethal weapons are a good idea based upon this research. When they're used properly. And so that's a good takeaway from all of this. When the officer is justified in using the weapon, and the weapon is used properly, it does prevent officer injuries as well as suspect injuries, as well as achieves the goals of getting the person under control, for the most part. There are exceptions to that, and, so these are all things to think about as we move forward. That's all I have for today, and I wanted to remind you all that you do have a discussion board and a quiz for this semester, this module that is due by Monday. And remember that these things are due at 5 p.m. on Monday. They're not due at midnight. I do that so that way you guys can remember 5 o'clock, and then we don't have to worry about midnight, and I know nobody will be staying up until midnight to do it, so you don't have to worry about that either. But if you have a day job, you might want to think about doing it on Sunday. I know some of you are doing it on Sundays, or you can do it, you could get a week behind, not a week behind, sorry, a week ahead and do it as soon as it becomes available. Anyway, that's all I have for today, so I hope you all have a good week, and email me if you have any questions. Thanks.